The horrific final days of Marie Adélaïde, the princess, broken by a face-destroying pox, in a magnificent Versailles where Duke Philippe lived as an openly gay man, supreme power meant nothing against brutal medicine. Marie Adélaïde was locked in a blazing room, her veins sliced open for bloodletting and forced to swallow poison as a virus entirely eroded her face. Place an 11-year-old girl, completely alone, into a gilded mausoleum disguised as a palace. In 1696, Versailles was no longer the triumphant epicenter of European culture. It had deteriorated into a suffocating, rigidly devout fortress, crushed by the paralyzing weight of endless etiquette. Arriving as a pawn in a fragile peace treaty, Marie Adélaïde stepped into an environment designed to crush individuality. She was entirely unaware of the tragedy that would eventually consume her dynasty. The court she entered was old. It was rigidly devout under the watchful eye of Madame de Maintenon and burdened by the weight of endless etiquette. The atmosphere was heavy with the scent of aging courtiers, relentless religious observance, and the looming shadows of disastrous wars that were bankrupting the nation. The royal family itself was a collection of bitter, exhausted individuals, trapped in a cycle of duty and suppressed resentment. Into this magnificent, suffocating tomb walked a child who entirely disrupted the established order. Bypassing the crushing expectations of quiet adaptation, she conquered Versailles entirely through a sheer, explosive force of personality that the aging court had not witnessed in decades. Eyewitness accounts from the era, particularly the notoriously cynical and exacting memoirs of the Duc de Saint-Simon, abandoned their usual venom to describe her. She possessed a doll-like petite stature that made her seem impossibly fragile. Yet she harbored an explosive, inexhaustible physical energy. Her chestnut hair framed a face dominated by enormous, brilliant black eyes, with remarkably long lashes, and her flawless porcelain skin became the standard of beauty for an entire generation. Beyond her flawless porcelain skin and brilliant black eyes, her true magnetism stemmed from an absolute, unapologetic refusal to be tamed by the oppressive environment. She ran through the sacred, silent halls of the palace. She threw her arms around the neck of the terrifying Louis XIV, a man whose mere gaze made seasoned generals tremble. She treated the absolute monarch of France not as a deity, but as a beloved grandfather, sitting on his lap, rifling through his private letters, and injecting a chaotic, vibrant joy into his rigid daily routine. For the aging king, she became an addiction. He explicitly declared her his ultimate joy, the single person capable of lifting the profound depression that had settled over his final years. He indulged her every whim with a desperation that shocked his ministers. When she desired a place to escape the suffocating protocol, he ordered the complete renovation of the menagerie at Versailles, transforming it into a private playground where she could host vibrant parties, churn her own butter, and briefly reclaim the childhood she had sacrificed for the crown. She danced through the Hall of Mirrors, organized midnight hunts in the forests, and filled the stale air with laughter. The entire court orbited around her vitality. However, beneath this dazzling surface, the crushing reality of her position remained. When the War of the Spanish Succession erupted and her father, the Duke of Savoy, betrayed France to join the enemy coalition, she found herself trapped. The public adored her, but the political factions despised her origins. The rumors of her functioning as a spy stealing war plans from the king's desk while pretending to play, haunted her. She was forced to wear a mask of perpetual, exhausting cheerfulness to ensure her survival and protect her position, hiding the intense psychological strain of a woman torn between the country of her birth and the empire she was destined to rule. The pressure mounted exponentially in 1711. A brutal outbreak of smallpox claimed the life of the Grand Dauphin, Louis XIV's only legitimate son. Overnight, Marie Adélaïde and her husband, the Duke of Burgundy, were thrust onto the direct steps of the throne. She became the Dauphine of France, the future queen. The crown was agonizingly close, and the survival of the Bourbon dynasty rested entirely on her fragile shoulders and the young sons she had borne. But the shadow of death that had taken her father-in-law had not left the palace grounds. It was merely waiting to change its method of execution. In February 1712, the court sought relief from the heavy atmosphere of Versailles by moving to the Palace of Fontainebleau. It was meant to be a brief respite, a change of scenery to lift the Dauphine's spirits. Instead, it became ground zero for a catastrophic biological event. Around the 5th of February, a sudden violent headache struck Marie Adélaïde, bypassing the familiar dull exhaustion of daily court life. A sudden blinding and paralyzing pain struck with enough force to immediately confine her to her bed. A terrifying spike in her body temperature quickly followed. The vibrant, endlessly energetic Dauphine was reduced to a shivering, feverish shell within hours. The court physicians, always hovering and eager to assert their authority, initially dismissed it as a passing fever. But as her skin began to burn to the touch and a profound, agonizing lethargy set in, panic began to ripple through the royal household. They ordered an immediate, desperate retreat back to Versailles, hoping the familiar surroundings and the full arsenal of royal medicine could halt whatever was consuming her. They did not know they were transporting a highly contagious mutating virus directly into the heart of the monarchy. Upon returning to Versailles, the true nature of the horror revealed itself. The true nature of the horror quickly revealed itself as malignant measles, a severe, highly lethal strain that completely bypassed the medical community's limited comprehension and their archaic methods of treatment. The biological destruction began with a terrifying visual manifestation. Her porcelain skin, celebrated in countless portraits, erupted in a dense maculopapular rash. It started as tiny, angry red pinpricks on her face, spreading with vicious speed down her neck and across her torso. The physical transformation was grotesque and rapid. The discrete red spots began to merge, entering the confluent stage of severe measles. The skin on her face swelled dramatically, transforming her delicate features into a swollen, unrecognizable mass of inflamed red tissue. The virus attacked her mucous membranes with equal ferocity. Severe conjunctivitis set in, causing her enormous black eyes to swell completely shut. The light of the candles in her bedchamber became a source of excruciating pain, forcing her into a state of temporary, terrifying blindness. She could no longer see the frantic faces of her attendants or the desperate grief of her husband. She could only feel the relentless burning agony of her own skin. The rash began to weep, oozing a yellowish fluid before cracking and forming thick, coarse crusts over her face. The Rose of Savoy, the living masterpiece of Versailles, was being physically eroded. A foul odor of infected fluid Stale sweat and impending death filled the room, a scent so overwhelming that it forced the heartbroken Louis XIV and his terrified courtiers to maintain a physical distance, watching their beloved light extinguish from afar. As her temperature soared past 40 degrees Celsius, she slipped into violent delirium. Her once melodic voice was reduced to guttural moans and incoherent pleas. It was at this critical juncture, when her body required hydration and cooling to fight the infection, that the true torment began. Enter Guy Crescent Fagin, the king's premier physician, a man wielding absolute medical authority and a terrifying adherence to medieval medical dogma. Fagin believed that disease was caused by corrupted humors within the blood that needed to be violently expelled from the body. Armed with this lethal ignorance, he approached the dying, delirious princess with a lancet. Despite her severe dehydration and failing strength, Fagin ordered her veins opened. They bled her repeatedly, draining the vital fluid she desperately needed to sustain her dropping blood pressure. When the bleeding failed to lower her raging fever, Fagin escalated his assault. He forced violent emetics, harsh, toxic concoctions often containing antimony or potent herbs steeped in wine, down her throat. The intent was to purge the illness through her stomach. The result was catastrophic. The emetics triggered violent, uncontrollable vomiting. Her frail, convulsing body was continuously racked by the effort of expelling fluids she no longer had. The treatment stripped her of her final reserves of strength, plunging her deeper into shock. Yet the medical torture was not confined to her body. It extended to the very environment she was forced to endure. Following the belief that the disease must be sweated out, Fagin ordered her bedchamber completely sealed. Every window was locked tight, heavily draped with thick velvet curtains to block out the winter draft and the painful light. Massive fires were stoked in the grand fireplaces, roaring day and night to create a suffocating, unbearable heat. The royal bedchamber was transformed into a literal suffocating oven. The air grew thick, heavy with the smoke of the fires, the metallic stench of the bloodletting basins, the sour smell of vomit, and the rotting scent of her decaying skin. It became a perfect incubator for bacteria, a plague chamber designed by the very men tasked with saving her life. Trapped in this dark, sweltering hell, blind, bleeding, and convulsing, the most cherished woman in France was systematically pushed toward the abyss. Beside her bed, ignoring every warning of contagion, sat her husband, the Duke of Burgundy. He refused to leave her side in the stifling darkness, continuously leaning down to kiss her crusted, weeping face and her bruised, bleeding hands, inhaling the very breath that was killing her, willingly sealing his own tragic fate as the hours ticked down toward an inevitable, devastating conclusion. As the relentless heat of the sealed bedchamber consumed the last remnants of oxygen, the frantic rhythm of Marie Adélaïde's failing heart began to slow. The horrific medical interventions, the incessant bloodletting, and the violent, exhausting purges orchestrated by Fagin had achieved nothing but the total depletion of her life force. Her physical form, once celebrated as the absolute pinnacle of youthful beauty, was now a tragic monument to the catastrophic ignorance of 18th century medicine. She lay motionless beneath the heavy velvet canopy, her eyes sealed shut by severe inflammation, her breathing reduced to a shallow, agonizing rattle. The Duke of Burgundy, paralyzed by a grief so profound it seemed to strip away his own rationality, remained anchored to her bedside. He was a man known for his intense, almost fanatical religious piety. Yet, in these final hours, his faith offered no shield against the brutal reality unfolding before him. He leaned into the infectious miasma, pressing his face against her ruined skin, whispering desperate prayers into an atmosphere thick with the smell of impending death. On February 12th, 1712, the devastating struggle finally ceased. The vibrant, irrepressible Dauphine, the sole source of light in the aging court of Versailles, exhaled her last breath at the age of 26. Silence, heavy and absolute, crashed down upon the sweltering room, broken only by the sudden gut-wrenching sobs of a husband who had just watched his entire world disintegrate. The news of her passing did not merely ripple through the vast corridors of Versailles. It struck with the concussive force of a physical blow. When the absolute monarch of France, King Louis XIV, was informed that his ultimate joy was gone, the meticulously constructed facade of the Sun King shattered completely. This was a ruler who had spent over 7 decades perfecting the art of emotional suppression, a man who had treated the deaths of queens, mistresses, and legitimate heirs with a chilling, stoic grandiosity. Yet the loss of Marie Adélaïde broke him in a way the court had never witnessed and would never forget. The iron-willed sovereign collapsed in a public display of raw, unrestrained agony. He wept openly, his tears stripping away the imposing aura of divine right to reveal a terrified, heartbroken old man standing on the edge of the abyss. Madame Palatine, the sharp-tongued and observant Duchess of Orléans, recorded the unprecedented scene with stark clarity, noting that the king was entirely undone. She observed that in his long, blood-soaked reign, he had only ever truly deeply loved 2 women, his mother, Anne of Austria, and the young Princess of Savoy, who now lay dead down the hall. His weeping echoed through the gilded chambers, a terrifying sound that signaled to every courtier that the invincible era of the Sun King was effectively over, buried alongside the young woman who had made his final years bearable. But the tragedy of 1712 was not content with a single victim. The virus that had destroyed the Dauphine was already multiplying silently within the veins of her grieving husband. The Duke of Burgundy was forcibly pulled away from his wife's infected corpse, his clothes reeking of the sick room, his mind completely unhinged by sorrow. The medical establishment, terrified by the sudden death of the Dauphine and completely misunderstanding the mechanics of contagion, ordered an immediate evacuation. They believed that the physical space of Versailles had become cursed, poisoned by toxic air and melancholic humors. In a desperate bid to save the heir to the throne, the king ordered the court to relocate immediately to the nearby Château de Marly. It was a chaotic, mournful exodus. Carriages clattered over the cobblestones in the dead of winter, carrying a terrified aristocracy away from the epicenter of the tragedy. This frantic exodus offered zero salvation. The rattling carriages carried the lethal seeds of the virus, securely harbored within the lungs of the fleeing aristocrats. The Duke of Burgundy rode toward Marly carrying the lethal seeds of malignant measles deep within his respiratory tract, incubated by his relentless, intimate exposure to his dying wife. Upon arriving at Marly, the illusion of safety evaporated almost instantly. The Duke of Burgundy, widely revered as the philosopher prince and the great enlightened hope for the future of France began to manifest the terrifyingly familiar symptoms. It started with the same violent, blinding headache that had struck his wife just days before. Then came the sudden, extreme spike in fever, his body burning with the invisible fire of the infection. For the Duke, the physical agony was compounded by a horrific psychological torture. He knew exactly what was happening to him. Having watched his wife's brutal deterioration hour by hour, he possessed a perfect, terrifying foresight of his own impending gruesome demise. He knew that the red spots beginning to pepper his skin would soon merge into a swollen, weeping mass. He knew that his vision would soon fail, and he knew with chilling certainty that Fagin and his army of physicians would soon approach with their lancets and their fatal remedies. And approach they did, completely blind to their own catastrophic failures. The royal doctors repeated their deadly protocol with robotic precision. They surrounded the feverish, terrified prince and began the relentless bloodletting, draining away the very cells his body desperately needed to fight the virulent infection. They forced the same harsh emetics down his throat, triggering violent convulsions and profound dehydration. The Duke, a man of profound intellect who had surrounded himself with reformist thinkers and planned to overhaul the archaic, oppressive structures of the French state, was reduced to a helpless, bleeding victim of medical dogma. Unlike his wife, whose vibrant energy had fought the disease with a chaotic frenzy, the Duke accepted his fate with a grim, fatalistic piety. He believed that this agony was a divine punishment, a necessary purging of his earthly sins to reunite with his beloved Adélaïde in the afterlife. He offered his arms to the doctor's blades without protest, his body rapidly failing under the dual assault of the lethal virus and the catastrophic treatments. Just 6 days after the death of the woman he loved, the Duke of Burgundy's tortured body finally surrendered. On February 18, 1712, he died at Marly, plunging the nation into a state of unprecedented, apocalyptic panic. The sheer speed of the devastation was incomprehensible to the 18th century mind. Within less than a week, the two brightest stars of the French monarchy, the future king and queen who represented the dawn of a new, enlightened era, had been brutally exterminated. Their deaths left a gaping, terrifying void at the very center of the state. The court was paralyzed by fear, realizing that no amount of royal blood, no fortress of protocol, and no army of physicians could protect them from this invisible slaughter. As the bodies of the young couple were prepared for their quiet, somber journey to the royal basilica of Saint-Denis, a new, even more terrifying realization dawned upon the weeping king and his terrified ministers. The Duke and Duchess of Burgundy had left behind 2 young sons, 2 fragile boys who now stood entirely exposed to the wrath of the plague and the deadly razor-sharp ignorance of the men sworn to protect them. The nightmare, they realized with a collective shudder, had only just begun. The journey to the royal necropolis of Saint-Denis was usually a spectacle of unrivaled majesty, a carefully choreographed display of divine right, even in the face of mortality. But on the freezing night of February 23, 1712, the funeral procession for the Duke and Duchess of Burgundy felt less like a grand state farewell and more like a hurried, terrified disposal of the cursed. 2 identical lead-lined coffins rattled over the icy cobblestones of Paris, carrying the shattered remains of the empire's brightest hopes. There were no jubilant crowds tossing flowers, only a silent, shivering populace watching from the shadows, terrified that the invisible plague might leap from the wooden carriages. Inside the carriage of the chief mourners, the silence was suffocating. Louis XIV, the magnificent Sun King, who had spent a lifetime demanding that his court project, absolute invulnerability, did not attend. Protocol forbade the monarch from exposing himself to the stench of death, but the reality was far more pathetic. The aging king was physically and psychologically incapable of watching the earth swallow the only woman who had made him smile alongside the grandson he had rigorously trained to inherit the world. As the heavy iron doors of the Saint Denis crypt groaned shut, sealing the young couple in perpetual darkness, a profound icy paranoia swept through the surviving members of the royal family. The sheer velocity of their deaths was completely unnatural. In an era where sudden demise was rarely accepted as a mere biological misfortune, the panicked courtiers immediately abandoned the theory of severe measles. They began to whisper the most toxic word in the French political vocabulary: poison. The atmosphere at the Château de Marly, where the court had fled in a futile attempt to escape the contagion, rapidly descended into a paranoid frenzy. Fear morphed into vicious suspicion, and the collective terror of the aristocracy required a scapegoat. The eyes of the grieving, terrified court locked onto the king's brilliant but scandalous nephew, Philippe, the Duke of Orleans. He was known for his fascination with chemistry, his private laboratories, and his brazen disregard for conventional morality. Because he stood to move closer to the throne with every death in the direct royal line, the whispers escalated into outright accusations. Servants swore they had seen his agents slipping mysterious powders into the Dauphin's snuff box. Courtiers claimed he had commissioned Italian assassins to engineer a toxin that mimicked a virulent fever. The Duke of Orleans found himself entirely isolated, shunned by his peers, and facing the very real threat of execution for high treason. The tragedy of the outbreak was now compounding itself, turning the grieving family into a nest of vipers ready to devour one another. King Louis XIV, though consumed by his own devastating grief, had to intervene to prevent a total collapse of the royal house. He ordered an immediate, highly publicized autopsy of the Duke and Duchess of Burgundy, a grotesque and desperate measure to definitively rule out poisoning. The royal surgeons, dissecting the ruined bodies of the once beautiful couple, found only the catastrophic internal damage consistent with severe, malignant disease and the lethal aftermath of continuous bloodletting. The official verdict was natural causes, but the autopsy did nothing to quell the terror. It only confirmed that an invisible, unstoppable killer was walking freely among them, and it was entirely immune to their wealth, their titles, and their fortress walls. The attention of the horrified nation now pivoted to the royal nursery. The survival of the Bourbon dynasty hung by the most fragile of threads, the two young sons of the deceased couple. The eldest, the Duke of Brittany, was a bright, energetic 5-year-old who had just been elevated to the terrifying position of Dauphin of France. His younger brother, the Duke of Anjou, was a quiet, delicate toddler of barely 2 years old. The king, desperate to protect the last remnants of his bloodline, ordered them completely isolated. But the lethal virus had already breached the nursery doors. brought in on the unwashed hands and infected breath of the courtiers, and servants who had moved between the sick rooms and the children's quarters. In the first week of March, less than a fortnight after his parents were sealed in their tomb, the 5-year-old Dauphin woke screaming. The terrifyingly familiar symptoms presented themselves with brutal speed. The blinding headache, the soaring, unnatural heat radiating from his small body, and the ominous appearance of a vicious, angry, red rash spreading across his pale face. The moment the child's fever spiked, the doors of the nursery swung open, and the true architects of the impending tragedy entered. Guy Crescent Fagan, the king's premier physician, arrived with his terrifying entourage of surgeons and apothecaries. Despite having just supervised the horrific, agonizing deaths of the boy's parents using the exact same methods, Fagan's belief in his archaic medical dogma remained absolute and unshaken. He did not see a terrified, suffering 5-year-old boy in need of comfort and hydration. He saw a vessel of corrupted humors that needed to be violently purged. Operating under a terrifying medical arrogance, Guy Crescent Fagan viewed the terrified 5-year-old boy merely as another vessel of corrupted humors requiring violent expulsion. The horrific irony of the moment was inescapable. The exact same steel lancets and the identical suffocating environmental conditions that had systematically dismantled the boy's parents were deployed once again with unquestioning precision. Ignoring the child's frantic screams, the royal surgeon severed his delicate veins, severely dropping his blood pressure and depriving his tiny immune system of vital resources. Toxic, bitter purgatives followed, triggering violent convulsions in a body already exhausted by a soaring fever. The nursery was rapidly transformed into a blazing, sealed furnace, heavy with smoke and the stench of blood. The devastating truth of the catastrophe became undeniable. The deadliest force walking the halls of Versailles was the absolute authority of the men entrusted with defeating the virus, systematically destroying the child's natural defenses until his heart simply stopped. On March 8, 1712, after days of unimaginable medically induced torture, the 5-year-old Duke of Brittany died. He was the third Dauphin of France to perish within a single apocalyptic year. The court was plunged into absolute despair. The dynasty was practically extinct, wiped out by a combination of viral mutation and breathtaking arrogant stupidity. Only one child remained, the 2-year-old Duke of Anjou. As the doctors solemnly prepared a death certificate for his older brother, they turned their cold, clinical gaze toward the toddler's crib. The little boy was already flushed, his tiny body burning with the same high fever, the telltale red spots beginning to blossom on his chest. Fagan, completely blind to the trail of corpses he had just engineered, prepared his lancets for the final royal patient. He stepped toward the crib, fully intending to bleed the 2-year-old, a procedure that would undoubtedly kill the child within hours and end the Bourbon dynasty forever. But as the physician reached out, a figure stepped directly into his path, physically blocking him from the child. It was Charlotte de la Motte Houdancourt, the Duchess of Ventadour, the boy's royal governess. She had stood by in helpless, agonizing silence as she watched the doctors butcher the child's parents and his older brother. She had seen the direct correlation between the arrival of the lancets and the arrival of death. In a moment of unprecedented, treasonous defiance, this middle-aged woman made a decision that would alter the course of European history. Madame de Ventadour did not argue with the king's premier physician. She simply refused him access. When Fagan demanded she step aside, invoking the absolute authority of King Louis XIV, she ignored him. She scooped the burning, feverish toddler into her arms, turned her back on the highest medical authority in the land, and marched into an adjoining private chamber. Before the stunned doctors could react, she slammed the heavy oak door shut and threw the iron deadbolt, locking herself and the dying boy inside. It was an act of staggering bravery and monumental insubordination. If the child died behind those locked doors, she would undoubtedly be accused of his murder and likely face the executioner. Outside, the physicians pounded furiously on the wood, shouting threats and demanding entry, insisting that without their immediate bleeding and purging, the boy would be dead by morning. Inside, Madame de Ventadour ignored the chaos. She created a sanctuary of common sense in a palace ruled by lethal dogma. She refused to bleed the fragile toddler. She refused to force toxic vomiting agents down his throat. Instead, she kept him warmly wrapped but ensured the room was adequately ventilated, providing fresh air instead of stifling smoke. Most importantly, she spoon-fed him cool water and mild wine, keeping him hydrated as his small body fought the raging viral infection. It was a tense, agonizing standoff that lasted for days. A single woman armed with mat, urnal instinct, and a cup of water, fighting a desperate battle against both a deadly plague and the entire arrogant establishment of French medicine. The standoff outside the heavy oak doors of the royal nursery became a grotesque theater of absolute power clashing with desperate maternal instinct. For days, the corridor echoed with the furious, incessant pounding of fists and the outraged demands of the medical establishment. Guy Crescent Fagan, humiliated and enraged by the defiance of a mere governess, practically ordered the doors to be battered down. He shouted warnings through the keyhole, assuring Madame de Ventadour that the child's blood was boiling with toxic humors, that his brain would fry within his skull without the immediate application of the lancet and the purging herbs. The courtiers who gathered in the hallway whispered in terrified, hushed tones, convinced that they were listening to the agonizing, slow murder of the final Bourbon heir. They believed that Ventadour, driven mad by grief over the deaths of the child's parents, had completely lost her mind and was now holding the destiny of the French Empire hostage. The tension was suffocating. If the young Duke of Anjou died behind that locked door, Ventadour would be dragged out and undoubtedly face charges of high treason, her name forever cursed as the woman who extinguished the lineage of the Sun King. Yet despite the thunderous threats of execution and the collective panic of the highest nobility in the land, the governess refused to turn the iron deadbolt. She stood her ground, an immovable shield between the terrified toddler and the lethal ignorance of 18th century science. Inside the sequestered chamber, the atmosphere was entirely different. It was a pocket of radical, forbidden common sense in a palace drowning in deadly dogma. The air was cool and breathable. Madame de Ventadour had immediately extinguished the roaring fires that the doctors had ordered, allowing the stifling, suffocating heat to dissipate. She cracked open a window, just enough to let the crisp, clean winter air circulate, sweeping away the stale, infected atmosphere that had characterized the death chambers of the child's family. The little Duke of Anjou lay in his crib, his small body burning with the ferocious fever of malignant measles, his skin violently erupting in the terrifying red rash. But unlike his parents and his older brother, he was not being bled dry. He was not being forced to vomit until his organs spasmed. Ventadour stayed by his side, day and night, applying cool, damp cloths to his burning forehead and chest to gently bring down his core temperature. When the child cried out in delirium, his throat parched and cracking from the viral infection, she did the exact opposite of the doctor's orders. Instead of starving him to dry out the disease, she patiently spoon-fed him small, steady amounts of cool water, mixed with a few drops of mild wine. She fought the deadly virus not with steel blades and toxic purgatives, but with relentless hydration, basic hygiene, and an absolute unwavering devotion to keeping the child's natural defenses intact. The physiological difference was staggering, though invisible to the screaming doctors outside. Left with his blood volume intact, the 2-year-old's immune system had the necessary resources to wage a brutal internal war against the measles virus. The rash spread furiously across his small body, but without the catastrophic dehydration caused by Fagin's emetics. His skin did not crack and weep in the same horrific manner as his mother's had. For nearly a week, the child hovered on the very precipice of death. There were terrifying nights when his breathing grew so shallow that Ventadour had to lean down to feel the faint wisp of air against her cheek to ensure he was still alive. She sat in the dim light, holding his tiny burning hand, murmuring soft prayers while the angry voices of the physicians continued to echo from the hallway. Then the inevitable turning point arrived. The furious fever that had consumed his family finally reached its peak, broke, and began a slow, steady retreat. The angry red macules on his skin stopped spreading, their vibrant color dulling into a faded, harmless brown before beginning to peel away. The child's breathing deepened, settling into a natural, exhausted rhythm. He opened his eyes, no longer clouded by the terrifying delirium of a 40-degree fever, and weakly asked for a drink. The brutal, invisible siege was over. Against all odds, the uneducated governess and the fragile toddler had defeated the plague. When Madame de Ventadour finally threw back the iron deadbolt and opened the oak doors, the silence that fell over the quarter was absolute. The medical men, who had been drafting their defensive reports to explain the inevitable death of the final heir, stared in complete shock. Fagin pushed his way to the front, expecting to find a corpse. Instead, he found a pale, exhausted but unequivocally recovering 2-year-old boy sitting up in his crib, drinking water from a silver cup. The premier physician of France was rendered entirely speechless. There was no scientific explanation within his archaic humoral framework for how a child could survive such a virulent fever without being violently purged of his bad blood. Rather than admitting his catastrophic failures, Fagin hastily retreated, muttering that it was a divine miracle, completely ignoring the blatant reality that his own absence was the only miracle that had occurred. The news of the child's survival tore through the Chateau de Marly and instantly reached the devastated ears of King Louis XIV. The aging monarch, who had spent the last several days physically incapacitated by grief and the terrifying prospect of a vacant throne, wept tears of profound, overwhelming relief. But this relief was immediately chased by a dark, agonizing realization. As he looked at the surviving toddler, the king was forced to confront the chilling truth. If this simple, defiant approach had been used on Marie Adélaïde, the Duke of Burgundy, and the older Dauphin, they might still be alive. The absolute monarch was forced to swallow the bitter fact that the brightest lights of his reign had been extinguished, not just by an act of God, but by the arrogant, unquestioned authority of the men he had personally appointed to protect them. The little Duke of Anjou was instantly elevated to the title of Dauphin of France. He was no longer just a royal child. He was the sole fragile thread preventing the collapse of the Bourbon dynasty and the plunge of the nation into a catastrophic civil war of succession. The court's attitude toward him transformed from distant reverence to a state of terrified, suffocating obsession. He became the most heavily guarded, meticulously monitored human being on the face of the earth. Madame de Ventadour, once facing the threat of execution for her insubordination, was instantly elevated to the status of a national hero. She was granted unprecedented authority over the physical environment of the new Dauphin, completely bypassing the medical establishment that had nearly murdered him. The child was isolated, his interactions strictly controlled, and his every breath analyzed for any sign of returning illness. But the survival of the heir did little to heal the profound, gaping psychological wounds inflicted upon the court. The Palace of Versailles, to which the king eventually returned, was a changed place. It was no longer the vibrant, beating heart of European culture. It was a magnificent empty shell haunted by the ghosts of the recent dead. The physical absence of Marie Adélaïde left a chilling void that no amount of royal protocol could fill. The king walked through the hall of mirrors where she had once danced with explosive energy, surrounded by an impenetrable silence. The menagerie she had so lovingly restored, where he had laughed and played at being a simple country girl, was shut down, its gates locked, the animals sold or given away. Louis XIV, the man who had commanded armies and reshaped the borders of Europe, found himself entirely defeated by the brutal reality of human mortality. He was a man out of time, a monarch who had tragically outlived his son, his grandson, his great-grandson, and the only woman who possessed the power to make him forget the crushing weight of his crown. The vibrant, youthful energy that Marie Adélaïde had injected into the dying court was permanently extinguished, replaced by a rigid, melancholic piety that suffocated the final years of the Sun King's reign. The courtiers moved through the gilded halls like terrified shadows, painfully aware that the absolute power of their monarch was a fragile illusion that could be shattered by a microscopic virus and a rusted lancet. Yet, the trauma of the year of the four Dauphins refused to settle into quiet mourning. The paranoia that had erupted during the crisis did not dissipate with the survival of the final child. The vicious rumors of poison continued to circulate with toxic persistence, entirely warping the social fabric of the court. The Duke of Orléans, despite the overwhelming evidence that the deaths were caused by a natural, albeit catastrophic, epidemic, remained entirely ostracized. The grieving nobility, unable to accept that a simple disease could so completely dismantle the divine order of the monarchy, clung desperately to the narrative of a sinister human plot. They needed a villain, a tangible enemy they could hate and punish, rather than accepting the terrifying randomness of biology. This deep-seated suspicion fractured the royal family, creating bitter, insurmountable divides that would echo far beyond the death of Louis XIV. The tragedy of Marie Adélaïde was not merely the horrific end of a beautiful princess. It was the catalyst that fractured the absolute authority of the fray. Each monarchy, exposing the lethal incompetence of its institutions and setting the stage for the turbulent, cynical era that would follow. The legacy she left behind was not one of triumphant dynasty, but a harrowing testament to the fragility of power, the devastating cost of ignorance, and the profound lingering trauma of a court that had watched its brightest star violently consume itself in the dark. The physical transformation of Versailles in the direct aftermath of February 1712 was as absolute as it was terrifying. The sprawling gilded palace, entirely designed to be a blinding reflection of the Sun King's eternal glory, plunged into a suffocating, uninterrupted mourning. The vibrant silks and shimmering brocades that usually filled the Hall of Mirrors were replaced by an ocean of heavy black wool and dark velvet. The relentless, exhausting schedule of court entertainments, the ballets, the midnight hunts, and the elaborate feasts that Adélaïde had orchestrated with such explosive energy abruptly ceased. In their place, a profound, chilling silence settled over the marble corridors. The courtiers, terrified by the sudden mortality of their ruling family, moved through the state apartments like shadows. Their voices dropped to fearful whispers. Every time they passed the sealed doors of the Dauphine's former bedchamber, the very room where her beauty had been systematically destroyed by the measles virus and the razor-sharp ignorance of the royal physicians, they averted their eyes, making frantic signs of the cross. The scent of stale incense and heavy beeswax candles replaced the fresh floral perfumes the young princess used to wear. The palace had ceased to be a home or a seat of government. It had become a magnificent, sprawling tomb, haunted by the memory of a young woman whose angelic smile had once manipulated the fate of an entire empire. At the absolute center of this gilded mausoleum sat Louis XIV. The aging monarch was forced to endure a psychological torment far worse than any physical illness. For over 7 decades, he had meticulously constructed the myth of his own divine right, cultivating an image of a sovereign completely detached from the ordinary vulnerabilities of human existence. He had survived wars, assassinations, and diplomatic betrayals with cold, calculated stoicism. Yet, the loss of his grandson and the radiant Savoyard princess shattered this carefully maintained illusion. Courtiers watched in quiet horror as the invincible king began to rapidly deteriorate. He forced himself to maintain the grueling public routine of his daily life, waking, dining, and sleeping in front of hundreds of onlookers, but the soul had entirely vacated his actions. The man who had once terrified the generals of Europe now spent hours staring blankly at the meticulous gardens from his window, his face a mask of profound, unresolvable grief. He quietly ordered the menagerie, the vibrant, rustic retreat he had built specifically for Adélaïde to escape the crushing weight of protocol, to be entirely locked down. The animals were removed, the doors barred, and the gardens left to overgrow. He simply could not bear to look at the physical spaces where she had once laughed, danced, and treated him not as a terrifying deity, but as a beloved grandfather. The death of the Dauphin did not just break his heart, it severed his final emotional connection to the world around him, leaving him entirely isolated at the pinnacle of absolute power. As the king withdrew into his silent mourning, the vacuum of power within the court was rapidly filled by a vicious, pervasive paranoia. The narrative of poison, initially a panicked rumor, calcified into an accepted, terrifying truth among the aristocracy. It is a fundamental flaw of human nature to prefer the malice of men over the sheer, indifferent randomness of biology. For the 18th century mind, it was entirely incomprehensible that a microscopic virus, aided by the catastrophic incompetence of their most revered medical authorities, could wipe out 3 generations of the royal family in a matter of days. It was far easier and far more sensational to believe that a brilliant, ruthless human mind was orchestrating the slaughter. The entire weight of this collective hysteria fell squarely on the shoulders of Philippe, the Duke of Orléans. As the king's nephew and the next adult male in the line of succession, he possessed the most obvious motive. Furthermore, his profound intellect, his deep fascination with chemistry, and his private laboratories, where he conducted scientific experiments, made him the perfect villain for a superstitious court. The Duke of Orleans found himself trapped in a waking nightmare. He was an incredibly forward-thinking man, a patron of the arts and sciences who despised the rigid, suffocating piety that had taken over Versailles in its later years. Now he was entirely ostracized, treated as a walking contagion not of disease but of treason. When he entered a room, the highest nobles of France would turn their backs, gathering their garments close to their bodies as if his very shadow could contaminate them. Whispers followed him down every corridor, detailing elaborate, entirely fabricated stories of Italian assassins and undetectable toxins slipped into the Dauphin's evening wine. The psychological toll was immense. He was forced to attend the king, watching his uncle age decades in a matter of weeks, knowing that the grieving monarch harbored the same dark suspicions as the rest of the court. Philippe demanded a formal trial, begging the king to allow him to clear his name to surrender himself to the Bastille if it meant a public investigation. But Louis XIV, weary and broken, refused. He simply ordered the Duke to remain silent and endure the suspicion, leaving the smartest man in the kingdom to bear the absolute hatred of the nation. It was a staggering historical irony. The man, universid, ally reviled as the murderer of the dynasty would, within a few short years, become the absolute regent of France, tasked with saving the very empire the court accused him of trying to destroy. While the adults of Versailles tore each other apart with grief and suspicion, the sole survivor of the biological massacre was being raised in an atmosphere of suffocating, terrifying overprotection. The 2-year-old Duke of Anjou, now the Dauphin, the future Louis XV, was entirely isolated from the toxic environment of the court. Madame de Ventadour, the governess who had defied the medical establishment and saved his life by locking him away from the physician's lancets, became his entire universe. She was elevated to a position of unprecedented power, granted absolute authority over the physical and emotional well-being of the heir. She recognized that the child was not merely recovering from a severe bout of malignant measles. He was a fragile psychological survivor of a profound trauma. The young prince grew up in a quiet, heavily guarded suite of rooms, completely cut off from the other children of the nobility. His daily routine was dictated by an intense obsessive monitoring of his health. Every cough, every sneeze, every slight change in his temperature sent shock waves of panic through the royal household. This environment of extreme caution profoundly warped the personality of the future king. Louis XV did not inherit the explosive, charismatic energy of his mother, Marie Adélaïde, nor did he possess the intellectual, reformist zeal of his father. Instead, he absorbed the profound melancholy and the underlying terror that permeated the palace. He learned very early that human life, no matter how elevated by wealth or divine right, was incredibly fragile. He realized that everyone he loved, including the beautiful mother he could barely remember and the stern great-grandfather who occasionally visited him, could vanish without warning. This deep-seated insecurity I manifested in a lifelong fear of death and disease, making him a secretive, hesitant, and profoundly melancholic monarch. The horrific medical trauma of 1712 did not just kill his family, it fundamentally altered the psychological makeup of the man who would rule France for the next 60 years, steering the country toward a path of political stagnation and quiet despair. The tragic loss of the Dauphine robbed the Bourbon dynasty of the one personality capable of connecting the monarchy to the changing tides of the 18th century. The consequences of the plague chamber extended far beyond the gilded gates of Versailles, sending massive shock waves across the geopolitical landscape of Europe. France was already locked in the exhausting, financially ruinous War of the Spanish Succession, a brutal conflict fought precisely over the issue of royal inheritance. The sudden catastrophic depletion of the French direct line threw the delicate diplomatic negotiations into absolute chaos. The Allied powers of Europe, led by Britain and the Holy Roman Empire, watched in stunned disbelief as the invincible Bourbon dynasty consumed itself from within. The deaths forced Louis XIV to make agonizing, humiliating concessions at the negotiating tables in Utrecht. He was fighting not just to secure the Spanish throne for his grandson, but to ensure that his own throne in Paris would not be engulfed in a civil war upon his death. The political leverage that France had meticulously built over half a century evaporated in the span of 3 weeks, undone by a mutating virus and the staggering incompetence of Dr. Guy Crescent Fagan. The catastrophic failures of the royal medical establishment during those dark weeks in February and March of 1712 also triggered a slow, reluctant shift in the scientific conscience of Europe. Fagan and his team of elite physicians never publicly admitted their lethal errors. They continued to blame corrupted humors and divine will for the horrific deaths of the Dauphin and Dauphine. However, the blatant reality that the youngest heir survived precisely because he was denied their violent treatments, spared the bloodletting and the emetics, was impossible to completely ignore. It planted a deep subversive seed of doubt in the minds of a younger generation of doctors and thinkers. The tragedy starkly highlighted the deadly limitations of dogmatic medieval medicine, accelerating the push toward a more empirical, observation-based approach to human biology. The agonizing death of Marie Adélaïde, suffocating in a sealed, sweltering room while her veins were drained by men convinced of their own infallibility, became a silent, tragic catalyst for the medical enlightenment that would slowly dawn in the decades to follow. As the years dragged on, the memory of the Rose of Savoy became a poignant, almost mythical symbol of a lost golden age. The courtiers who survived the reign of Louis XIV would look back on the brief, dazzling period of her influence as the last true era of grace and vitality in the French monarchy. When the Sun King finally died in 1715, his body ravaged by gangrene and his empire nearly bankrupt, the rigid, devout court he had built immediately shattered. The regency period that followed, under the leadership of the once accused Duke of Orleans, was an explosion of cynical, hedonistic relief. The nobility fled the heavy, haunted halls of Versailles for the vibrant, pleasure-seeking salons of Paris. The profound trauma of the plague chamber, the terrifying realization of their own mortality, drove them to embrace a frantic, desperate pursuit of worldly pleasure. The profound emotional connection between the crown and the people, a connection entirely embodied by the radiant charm and spontaneous warmth of Marie Adélaïde, was permanently severed. The Bourbon dynasty survived the biological onslaught of 1712, but it lost its soul in the process, entering a long, slow decline that would ultimately end with a virus, but with the brutal, unforgiving blade of the guillotine. The sudden and violent extermination of the future of the French monarchy left a paralyzing void that history abhors, and into this vacuum rushed a torrent of historical debate that continues to divide scholars today. Long after the tears of the Sun King had dried, and the physical horror of the plague chamber had faded from living memory, the true nature of Marie Adélaïde's political legacy was dragged into the harsh light of historical scrutiny. The central controversy, one that haunted her during her life and threatens to define her in death, hinges on a devastating accusation. Was the radiant savior of Versailles actually a deeply embedded spy? The Duke of Savoy, her father Victor Amadeus II, was a man of notorious political elasticity. During the catastrophic War of the Spanish Succession, he brazenly betrayed his alliance with France, turning his armies against the very nation that housed his daughter. In the suffocating, paranoid atmosphere of Versailles, Marie Adélaïde found herself entirely isolated, her blood suddenly making her an enemy of the state. Rumors furiously circulated through the hidden corridors that the Dauphine was utilizing her unfettered access to the king's private chambers to sift through classified military documents. It was whispered that the young woman who playfully sat on the monarch's lap and rummaged through his desk was actually memorizing troop movements, quietly funneling state secrets back to Turin. This accusation presents a profound and agonizing contradiction of human experience. On one hand, you have a young woman entirely dependent on the goodwill of a foreign absolute monarch for her survival and the survival of her children. On the other hand, you have a daughter bound by the intense, almost tribal loyalty demanded by her ambitious father. Decades after the tragedy, letters were uncovered that suggested she did indeed maintain a clandestine caresse en dents with Savoyard agents. However, the exact nature of these letters remains a fiercely debated topic. Detractors argue they are the undeniable proof of high treason, the smoking gun that brands her a smiling traitor who smiled at French generals while secretly orchestrating their defeat on the battlefield. Defenders, however, point to the agonizing psychological reality of a teenage girl held essentially as a high-value hostage in a hostile court. They argue that her letters were not the calculated espionage of a political mastermind, but the desperate, terrified communications of a young woman trying to pacify a demanding father while simultaneously protecting her precarious position in France. The truth likely lies in a tragic middle ground. She was a woman forced to play a lethal game of geopolitical chess before she had even reached adulthood, using her charm and vivacity not just to entertain a bored king, but as a vital shield to deflect the constant looming threat of ruin. Her story highlights the brutal, uncompromising reality faced by royal women of the era, whose bodies and loyalties were commodified as tools of the state, leaving them to navigate a minefield of conflicting devotions, where any misstep meant total annihilation. Beyond the geopolitical scandals, a quieter but equally profound controversy surrounds the hidden domestic alliances she forged to maintain her grip on power. The traditional narrative paints Marie Adélaïde as the sole source of light in the king's life, a solitary force of nature, yet historical archives and the private diaries of the era reveal a far more complex, highly strategic partnership with the most unlikely of allies, Madame de Maintenon. Maintenon, the king's unacknowledged morganatic wife, was the absolute antithesis of the young princess. She was an aging, severely devout woman who enforced the stifling atmosphere of piety that gripped the late court. Publicly, the two women represented fundamentally opposing forces. Privately, however, they orchestrated an incredibly sophisticated symbiotic mechanism to manage the moods and decisions of the absolute monarch. Maintenon recognized that her own austere presence often exacerbated the king's deep bouts of depression, while the Dauphine possessed the unique explosive energy required to pull him back from the brink. The older woman quietly mentored the younger, guiding her through the treacherous invisible traps of court etiquette, and advising her on exactly when to push the king and when to retreat. In return, Marie Adélaïde treated the unrecognized wife with the absolute deference of a reigning queen, solidifying Maintenon's ambiguous position. This hidden alliance reveals the Dauphine not merely as a frivolous dancing child, but as an incredibly astute, highly adaptable political survivor who understood exactly how to leverage the fragile human emotions of the people who held her life in their hands. The ripples of her horrific death also triggered a profound silent revolution within the darkened halls of European medicine. Guy Crescent-Fagan, the man who had ordered the endless bloodletting and the suffocating fires, went to his grave completely unrepentant, fiercely defending his catastrophic actions as the pinnacle of scientific thought. But the agonizing demise of the Dauphine, followed so rapidly by the death of her husband and child under the exact same medical protocols, could not be erased by arrogant justifications. In the underground anatomical theaters and the quiet dissenting corners of the medical community, the tragedy became a catalyst for fierce debate. The undeniable reality that the youngest heir, Louis XV, survived solely because a governess physically barred the physicians from his room was a damning indictment of the entire humoral theory. Doctors began to quietly question the validity of draining the lifeblood from patients already ravaged by fever. The sealed, stifling plague chamber that had Exili rated the Dauphine's death became a textbook example of what not to do, slowly paving the way for the radical concepts of ventilation, hydration, and the observation of the body's natural defenses. The horrific, unnecessary suffering of Marie Adélaïde was not entirely in vain. Her blood, spilled on the sheets of Versailles, helped to slowly wash away the lethal medieval dogmas that had held medical science captive for centuries. The tragedy forced the scientific world to look at the brutal reality of their failures, sparking the slow, agonizing dawn of modern medical thought. Yet the most profound and lasting consequence of the tragedy was etched into the mind of the single fragile boy who survived the massacre. Louis XV inherited the throne at the age of 5, an orphan entirely surrounded by the ghosts of his family and the crushing weight of an empire. The psychological scarring inflicted by the events of 1712 completely dictated the trajectory of his 60-year reign. The terror of the sick room, the sudden, inexplicable disappearance of his parents and brother, and the suffocating overprotection that followed his survival created a monarch crippled by a profound, inescapable fear of death. Unlike his great-grandfather, who thrived in the massive public spectacle of Versailles, Louis XV despised the grand state apartments. He felt entirely exposed and vulnerable in the vast, echoing spaces where his family had been wiped out. As a result, he fundamentally altered the physical and political geography of the monarchy. He ordered the construction of the petits appartements, a hidden labyrinthine network of small, secret, heavily guarded rooms tucked behind the grand facades. He retreated into these private spaces, governing France from the shadows, entirely severing the visual, emotional connection between the king and the court. The vibrant, accessible monarchy that his mother, Marie Adélaïde, had so effortlessly embodied was permanently lost. Louis XV became a phantom king, ruling an empire while constantly looking over his shoulder, waiting for the invisible killer that had destroyed his childhood to return and finish the job. The absence of Marie Adélaïde created a devastating cultural and political chasm that the French monarchy never successfully bridged. She was the vital, missing link between two vastly different eras. Had she lived to become queen, her unique blend of traditional royal dignity and vibrant, empathetic charm could have guided the nation through the volatile transition from the heavy, absolute Baroque era of Louis XIV to the changing, questioning world of the Enlightenment. She possessed the rare ability to command absolute respect while inspiring genuine, passionate love, a delicate balance that her son entirely failed to achieve. Her premature death abruptly snapped the emotional tether that bound the French people to their rulers. The nation watched the monarchy retreat into cynical, hedonistic detachment during the Regency, and later into the paranoid, secretive isolation of Louis XV. The glorious narrative of the Sun King ended not with a triumphant crescendo, but with the pathetic, agonizing cries of a woman suffocating in a sealed room, destroyed by the very establishment sworn to protect her. The story of the Dauphine remains a haunting testament to the fragile beauty of human experience, a stark reminder that beneath the gilded crowns and the absolute power, history is ultimately shaped by the unpredictable, terrifying vulnerabilities of the human body and the devastating cost of human ignorance. The profound cultural and psychological trauma inflicted by the events of 1712 extended far beyond the immediate grief of the royal family, embedding itself deep into the collective consciousness of the French nation. For decades, the absolute monarchy had relied on a carefully curated mythology of divine invulnerability. The king and his direct heirs were presented not merely as political rulers, but as semi-divine figures anointed by God, physically and spiritually superior to the masses they governed. The horrific, agonizing deaths of the Duke and Duchess of Burgundy, followed instantly by their young son, completely shattered this meticulously constructed illusion. The French populace, who had previously viewed the royal family with a mixture of awe and fearful reverence, were suddenly forced to confront the stark, uncomfortable reality of their ruler's biological fragility. The rumors that bled out from the sealed gates of Versailles, tales of the radiant Dauphine rendered unrecognizable by weeping sores, of the future king bleeding to death at the hands of his own physicians, and of a desperate governess barricading a toddler in a room to save his life, demystified the crown in a way no political pamphlet ever could. The people realized that the glittering inhabitants of the palace bled, suffered, and died with the same grotesque indignity as the poorest peasants in the slums of Paris. This brutal demystification planted the earliest, most insidious seeds of skepticism regarding the divine right of kings. The emotional tether that Marie Adélaïde had so effortlessly maintained through her spontaneous charm and visible vitality was permanently severed, replacing public adoration with a quiet, creeping cynicism that would fester for generations. This creeping cynicism found its most potent expression in the intellectual undercurrents of the era. The tragedy of the plague chamber became a silent rallying cry for the early thinkers of the Enlightenment, who were beginning to question the dogmatic, unquestioned authority that governed both the state and the sciences. The catastrophic failure of Dr. Guy Crescent Fagan and his team of elite physicians was impossible to hide. the highest medical authorities in the land, armed with absolute power and backed by centuries of established academic tradition, had effectively tortured the royal family to death, while a medically uneducated governess, armed only with a cup of cool water and common sense, had saved the sole remaining heir. This stark contrast provided devastating ammunition for philosophers and medical reformers who argued that blind adherence to ancient texts and inherited dogmas was not just ignorant, but actively lethal. The horrific demise of Marie Adélaïde, suffocating in a dark, blistering room while her veins were repeatedly open, became the ultimate tragic case study in the dangers of intellectual arrogance. In the decades that followed, the rigid humoral theories that dictated the purging and bleeding of fever patients began to face mounting, fierce resistance. The tragic loss of the Savoyard princess inadvertently fueled a slow but relentless revolution in empirical observation, pushing the medical community toward a future where the preservation of the body's natural strength would gradually replace the violent medieval extraction of corrupted fluids. Her unimaginable suffering forced a necessary, albeit painfully slow, reckoning within the halls of European medicine, yet the most immediate and disastrous political consequence of the tragedy manifested in the psychological ruin of the boy who survived it. Louis XV, the fragile toddler pulled from the brink of death by Madame de Ventadour, inherited a throne surrounded by the terrifying ghosts of his family. The suffocating, hypervigilant environment in which he was subsequently raised, designed entirely to protect him from the invisible pathogens that had annihilated his parents, crippled his ability to effectively govern the French Empire. He grew into a chronically insecure, deeply melancholic monarch who harbored a lifelong paralyzing phobia of illness and death. He possessed none of the explosive, unifying charisma of his mother, nor the diligent, reformist intellect of his father. Instead of confronting the mounting financial and social crises of the 18th century, Louis XV retreated into the labyrinthine, secret apartments he constructed behind the grand staterooms of Versailles. He isolated himself with a succession of mistresses, desperately seeking the emotional intimacy and spontaneous joy that had been violently ripped from his life in 1712. The monarchy transitioned from the grand, visible, and deeply personal institution of the Sun King into a faceless, detached, and increasingly despised administrative machine. The people of France, who had once wept openly in the streets for the lost Rose of Savoy, eventually grew to despise her surviving son, viewing him as a weak, indifferent phantom who cared more for his private pleasures than the starving populace. The biological massacre of his family had left Louis XV with an empire he was terrified to rule and a life he was terrified to lose. As the 18th century ground toward its bloody, inevitable conclusion, the memory of Marie Adélaïde became a poignant, almost mythical symbol of a lost golden age of the Bourbon dynasty. The older courtiers, who had survived the grim final years of Louis XIV, would walk through the echoing empty hall of mirrors and whisper stories of the vibrant, chestnut-haired girl who used to defy the suffocating protocol to make the Sun King laugh. The menagerie she had lovingly rebuilt was eventually demolished, its physical traces erased, but the legend of her brief, dazzling reign over the court remained. She embodied a tragic, unsolvable paradox that came to define the era itself. To the political factions who despised her foreign blood, she was the ultimate liability, the whispered traitor who prioritized her Savoyard heritage over her French destiny. But to the king and the vast majority of the court, she was the singular, radiant savior of a dying dynasty, the only human being capable of injecting genuine warmth into an institution slowly suffocating under the weight of its own grandeur. The truth of her existence was violently cut short before she could have or fully reconcile these opposing identities, leaving history to judge a woman who was forced to play a lethal game of survival on the most treacherous political stage in the world. Ultimately, the story of Mary Adélaïde de Savoy, the Duchess of Burgundy, transcends the confines of a mere royal biography. It is a harrowing, deeply human narrative about the collision of absolute power and absolute vulnerability. It strips away the gilded mythology of Versailles to expose the raw, terrifying reality of a world where a microscopic virus held more authority than the most powerful monarch on earth, and where the arrogance of men wielding medical instruments proved far deadlier than any assassin's blade. Her horrific descent from the absolute pinnacle of beauty and influence into a state of unrecognizable, agonizing decay serves as a brutal reminder of the inescapable fragility of the human condition. The Grand Palace of Versailles, with its sweeping gardens and towering monuments to vanity, could not barricade its doors against the indiscriminate cruelty of nature. In the end, the woman who commanded the absolute devotion of an empire, whose smile manipulated the fate of nations, died alone in the dark, destroyed by the very establishment sworn to save her. Her legacy is not written in the treaties of the era or the lineage of kings, but in the profound, enduring lesson of her suffering, that beneath the crowns, the titles, and the illusions of invincibility, we are all ultimately bound by the same fragile, fleeting mortality, and that true terror often wears the mask of absolute authority.